Hi, I'm Eileen Bild. I am with OTEL Talk. And today I have Dr. Greg Hammer. He is a professor at Stanford University School of Medicine. He also has a research lab where he studies pharmacology. And he has a private practice for pediatric intensive care medicine and pediatric anesthesiology. And finally, he's a wellness enthusiast. Welcome, Greg.
Great to see you again, Eileen.
Yes, and this is a series. This is one in this series of interviews that we have been doing for your book. And the book that we're going to be talking about today is Gain Without Pain. And the chapter we'll be spotlighting is on gratitude, which I think today is very important. So you start this chapter with the idea that gratitude is the foundation for happiness. So tell me more about that.
It just occurs to me that happiness is based on certain very fundamental concepts, and one of them is gratitude. And grateful people are happy, and ungrateful people are not happy. And it's true, I think, that one can be blind and happy, or deaf and happy, or otherwise physically challenged and happy. One can certainly be poor and happy. There are a lot of examples on that. I even saw a great film about that. I think it was called Happy, if I remember. But you won't see a person who's ungrateful and happy.
That's a good point.
I think it's an easy to digest way of kind of understanding that happiness and gratitude are inexorably linked.
Well, to me, gratitude is like a gift. And you agree, you also mentioned that in your book, that I think just the breath of life is a gift. And that if we can just in our mind envision life as that gift that allows us to explore, to enjoy, to tap into what we can be grateful for. And you talk about taking nothing for granted to learn to be more grateful. So did you have a life experience where you weren't taking things for granted, and something happened, and you had to learn to be grateful for it?
Well, you know what? I think that if we are observant, we have all had such experiences. I remember once when I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, I was young and I was in college there, and I was sort of distracted in my head, and I was outside and I was about to cross a busy street, and I stepped off the curb and a bus sped by. And I think I actually felt the bus, the metal on the side of the bus brush the tip of my nose.
Oh, wow.
That's how close it was. And I just realized, that had happened just a second later, I was killed or badly injured. And I realized at that time that, we take for granted that we can just walk across the street, or we can take our next breath, or we can pick up the phone, what have you. It's just so many things in our daily lives we take for granted when you think about it. I think even a more profound experience I had, which was not just a momentary thing, but which was a little bit more spread out in time, is that about 10 years ago, I was just feeling awful. I felt like I was coming down with the flu, but it felt sort of different, and it lasted for weeks and weeks and went on for months. I know you've had some experience with fibromyalgia. I felt like maybe I had something like that. And eventually I went to my internist, and excuse me, he did a bunch of blood tests, and my lymphocyte count was kind of elevated, but we thought it was probably just in response to some viral infection. And then this kind of dragged on for a few more months, and I went back and I ended up having another blood test, and I was ultimately diagnosed with a form of chronic leukemia. And the thing about CLL, or chronic lymphocytic leukemia, is that we don't generally get treated, at least in the chemotherapy era, until things are really bad, because the chemotherapy is only helpful for a short period of time. So we usually try to hold that in reserve till later. And just knowing that you have a malignancy and you feel awful and you're not even getting treated for it, it's pretty psychologically difficult. It's called watch and wait in CLL. I got myself into a clinical trial, and fast forward, I take a pill every day and I'm totally fine. There's no evidence of this abnormal lymphocyte in my body with
That's amazing.
blood testing. And so, again, when I was diagnosed, I thought, I'm be lucky if I live to the age that I am now, and probably won't live that long. And so I would sit in my hot tub at night and gaze at the sky and wonder how many more evenings I would have to enjoy that experience. And here I am, I've sort of outlived my expectation, and it's just a miracle. So when I do my G.A.I.N meditation every morning, the G for gratitude comes quite easily to me, because I'm just grateful for this day. I'm grateful for being alive and breathing, and just being able to enjoy everything that life has to offer. So, I've had lots of little near misses, like I think we all have, starting with that experience with crossing the street and almost being hit by a bus. And then I've had some fairly miraculous things, like the one I just explained. And so I think if we all look inward and we all look even outward, we know that we're extremely lucky to be where we are. Things could just be so much worse. No matter how bad they seem, things could be much worse, and we should be grateful that they aren't.
And that's a great point. I believe, to extend on what you've said, that everybody has a story. I don't think there'd be one person on this earth as an adult and even as a child who hasn't had some experience where there's something that we experience in which we could be angry about or it's fearful of. But as long as there's that element of gratitude part of that experience, then it doesn't make it seem as bad. And it sounds like, the bus grazing you was maybe a wake up call of some sort. And perhaps it caused you to be more aware of your surroundings. And then the medical diagnosis, it sounds like it's long term, right? I mean, it's a lifelong condition that as long as you take these pills, as far as you can tell up to this point, you could live another 30, 40 years or to
Right.
100, right?
That's right. I could even be cured. It's a new therapy, so we don't know if I stop taking it, if it would come back or not. But yes, you're exactly right.
So that leads me to talk about the brain, how the brain reflects on being grateful. And in the book, you talk about the brain continually changes, it's malleable, and it creates neural synaptic connections based on habitual patterns. So, as you were telling your stories, it caused me to think about, um, experiences come into our life, I believe, for reasons, whatever those reasons might be. And sometimes things get repeated for us to learn whatever it is we need to learn. So if we have habitual patterns and the brain is malleable and can change, what's your concept or thinking about gratitude in that area?
Well, I think I can answer your question this way. We have a couple of characteristics that explain a lot of our thought processes as humans. I think we're all somewhat hardwired to have these two ways of thinking. And the first one is we have a negativity bias. So we tend to remember the negative experiences and thoughts that we have and forget about the positive ones. So that's all, I think that's all of us. I think we all tend to think that way. The other thing is that we have an obsession with the past and the future. Our brains are constantly kind of rehashing things that have happened and then going to the future and fussing over what might happen. And I kind of break our thought processes down in that respect as being adaptive or maladaptive. For example, it's adaptive to think about the past when it comes to learning from our mistakes, when it comes to savoring the wonderful experience we've had with nature, with loved ones, etc. And it's adaptive to think about the future to the extent that we need to plan to put bread on the table, as it were, and we need to look forward to wonderful times. That's part of what keeps us going. So those are adaptive ways to think about the past and the future. But beyond that, we kind of obsess over maladaptive thoughts. And that means in the past, we go over and over things that we wish had gone better, that we could have done, we should have done differently. And we feel regret and remorse, and we feel ashamed. And in the thoughts of the future, we think about the uncertainty, and the pandemic has sort of underscored this. And it's maladaptive to be stuck on thoughts of the future beyond the considerations of planning in a practical way and looking forward to fun times. And that is, our thoughts are centered around fear and anxiety because we're fixated on these thoughts of the future, which is uncertain at best. And so I think that our brains are, to some extent, wired to have this negativity bias and to have this fixation on the past and the future. And we could talk about teleologically why that may be true, why those considerations may have been adaptive, to be aware of constant threats in the environment. You know, perhaps there's a saber-toothed tiger lurking right outside the mouth of the cave. The fact is that we don't have that threat anymore. Most of us don't anyway. We don't live in neighborhoods that are that dangerous that we always have to worry about being shot or attacked or whatever. So our brains, though, for their sort of soft programming, I think, toward being having this negativity bias and having these obsessions with thoughts of the past and the future rather than being present, which is where happiness lives, have established these patterns. I mean, I would liken it to, let's say, you know, we tend to, let's say, keep our muscle tension in our shoulders. You know, we're working at our computer or we're doing other things, and we tend to, when we're a little bit stressed, kind of tighten up our neck and shoulders. And so after a while, that becomes our posture. And of course, you know, we have aches and pains in our shoulders, our neck. We may get chronic headaches from that. And this has sort of become programmed into our muscle tone, our muscle memory. But as you pointed out, our brains are malleable. We have this thing called neuroplasticity. That means that we can change the way we think. And just as though we may want to change our posture, we go to a physical therapist, for example, and they point out why it is and how it is that we're holding our tension the way we are with our shoulders and our neck. With intention, we can actually rewire the way we maintain our posture. We can rewire the way our those muscles and cause them to contract the way. But it takes time, and we have to do this in small incremental steps. And I think that's a good model for the way our brains work as a whole. So they're sort of wired. I hesitate to use the word hardwired. I guess I would just say they're wired to have this negativity bias and this obsession with the past and the future, but we can change that. And I think gratitude, in part, is letting go of this negativity bias through our intention, which is the I in G.A.I.N, and becoming more appreciative of what we have rather than focusing due to our negativity bias on what we don't have. Oh, it could have been this way, it could have been that way. If I'd only, you know, bought this stock back then, I'd be a multimillionaire today, and kind of fixating on that, or I shouldn't have sold it, or I shouldn't have bought it, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Let's sort of, using our intention, our purposefulness, start to become more positive in the way we think, and therefore be grateful. And we can do it. We just have to identify the patterns that we have embraced, subconsciously for the most part, recognize them, and then point our mindful energy, our intention at gradually reshaping them.
Great dialogue of explaining um, the different ways of looking at past, present, and future. And to me, it's destructive to focus on the negative of what was and what can be. But I think a lot of people struggle with making that shift. So, my question to you is, because you practice your G.A.I.N meditation, uh, do you have a tip that you can share with those listening for, like, what's the first step that you would recommend for them to break free of that negative bias pattern in order to get to the other side and be able to be in that present moment of gratitude?
I would say the first step is recognizing the way our thought processes are working. So when we're wringing our hands over something that happened yesterday or last week or last year, let's just say, bring it to something that sounds fairly mundane and materialistic. Oh, I was thinking of buying Apple stock, 10 years ago, and I was thinking about it, and I didn't do it. And if I had just done that, I would have had $5 million today. And we're kind of like thinking about that and kicking ourselves and getting frustrated and feeling negative, like I'm stupid. That was just, I wish I would have done that. And, you can almost feel the tension in someone's thought process when you even contemplate that way of thinking. So the first step is to recognize that we're thinking that way. So I would suggest to people that the next time they're having very negative thoughts, recognize it. So kind of be on the lookout for it. Be on the lookout for that next time we're having negative thoughts and identify it, saying, wow. So if we're thinking about somebody we had a disagreement with and we're judging them and we're thinking all these negative thoughts about them, well, remember that N in G.A.I.N is non-judgment. So the first thing is to identify that we're having these negative thoughts, and certainly having harsh judgments of others or ourselves are negativistic thoughts. The first thing is to recognize that we're doing this. Why am I having negative thoughts about that person? Okay, we got in an argument over something. Is it really that important? No, not really. I mean, I pretty much like that person. And even if it's somebody that I don't generally like to spend time with, there must be something positive about that person. I mean, they're a human being. So recognize that we're having these negative thoughts, agree with ourselves that those negative thoughts are not helpful. And in fact, they're holding us back, they're harmful. So that's the first step. And then once you recognize that you're doing it, the next step is to remember that you have a choice. Your thought processes are a matter of choice. When you decide subconsciously, perhaps, to have these negative thoughts about your neighbor, you're deciding not to have warm and loving feelings about your neighbor because they're a human being. They've had their own hardship. I have empathy for them. Maybe they act in a way that I don't think is very nice sometimes. It's because they lost a parent at a young age, or their parents were abusive, or whatever. It doesn't really matter when you think about it. There's something very wonderful about this person. They're a human being. And so recognize we're having these negative thoughts, whether it's judgment or otherwise. Remember that we have this negativity bias, so we tend to do that. And remember that that's something we can change by taking small steps, by recognizing that we're being negative when we are, diving a little bit deeper into that thing we're being so negative about, and remember that, hey, I'm making a choice. I can be positive about that. I can take the goodness in this person and sort of hold that rather than these negative thoughts. So that's how we get started. That's how we point ourselves in the right direction.
So
I would say, Eileen, it's much like, I just remembered that I'm sitting in this way and my shoulders are really tight. And, I have this tendency to kind of like fire these nerves that go to these muscles that contract these muscles, but it's giving me neck pain. I'm not sleeping well. I get headaches. Hey, a light bulb goes off. I recognize that I'm doing that. I don't have to sit that way. I don't have to scrunch up my shoulders. I'm doing that instead of relaxing and maybe moving my shoulders and getting these muscles to relax. So we have the power of neuroplasticity, whether it's the nerves going to our muscles or the nerves that are all, talking to each other in our heads, generating thoughts.
So it sounds like several things. It's becoming an observer in order to recognize and to take that first step to create that change and to be patient with understanding the process of uh, what I like to say is re-engineering the brain and getting it to go down a different highway. So it's almost like you're changing lanes and you're going to perhaps slow down versus go in the fast lane. So it can bring you a better life experience.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important too how we approach this process of changing the way we think. The first is baby steps. That's how we learn. We learn in small increments, sort of one concept at a time. The second is regularity. So do it every day. And the third is where we have a negativity bias and we tend to be judgmental and probably most harshly of ourselves. So let's let go of that. So go back to the, sort of the mundane issue of the muscle tension I have created in my neck and my shoulders. So I recognize that I'm doing it. I decide that I'm going to, do these relaxation maneuvers. And that going forward, I'm going to try to recognize when I'm doing it and let go of that neural activity causing those muscles to contract. And when I recognize that I'm doing it, I'll do some loosening up. I'll take baby steps, and I'm not going to judge myself harshly because, tomorrow I do it again, right? I'm just going to simply be non-judgmental of myself. And when I recognize that I'm holding all this tension in my neck and shoulders, I'm just going to change the way I'm holding my posture without self-judgment, and recognize that it took years for me to get into this rut of carrying my tension in this way. It's not going to change overnight. So baby steps, but recognize it maybe a little bit every day when I'm sitting at my computer, and not be judgmental of myself for doing this. I'm human.
Make it sound so easy.
Well, you take that exact same thought process and now you apply it to being judgmental. So for example, say you're a person who doesn't like to drive, but now that COVID is waning and you have to drive to work again, you realize how aggravated you get when you're driving and you see somebody who's, for example, changes into your lane without using their turn signal, and maybe they cut you off a little bit, and you get just so aggravated. And by the time you get to your destination, you're like a mess. So
very common, by the way.
Absolutely. Exactly like you would treat letting go of the tender neck and shoulders. Okay. Recognize that you're doing it. Remember that you, in your G.A.I.N meditation, pledged to be non-judgmental of others and eventually yourself. And just when you're starting to form that judgment, when you're starting to scrunch up your shoulders, you recognize it and you kind of laugh a little bit and just let go of that thought. Let go of that judgment. One judgment at a time, without being self-critical for doing it, recognizing that you've gotten into this pattern of thinking and judging over decades, perhaps. You're not going to become fully non-judgmental right away, but just recognize that you're doing it. Decide you're going to let it go. Smile at that person a little bit. Recognize that when you're in a hurry, sometimes you might drive that way too. Cut the other person some slack. And again, it's like baby steps, but do it a little bit pretty soon, every time you get in your car, you're preparing yourself to start to form a judgment because you know you get aggravated when you drive, and you're already ready to recognize that judgment and drop it. And one little baby step at a time, perhaps every day, 3 to 6 months hence, you're going to look back and think, wow, I am so much more non-judgmental of other people. I'm so much less aggravated when I'm driving than I was 6 months ago. And that's how we change.
And it sounds like if you just start those baby steps, that there's automatic progress that occurs, and at some point you'll recognize, like you said, wow, okay, so I'm much more relaxed now, and then it motivates. It's a motivator to continue with that gratitude and uh, being in that present moment and not so much in the anger and having those habitual patterns.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think some people might have a fear. You talk about fear, um, and if we're stuck in fear, fear of change, fear of who am I going to be if I'm not this person anymore, you mentioned that it suppresses our problem-solving skills. It doesn't help us with our temper control, and it impacts our memory. So I see fear as something that's constrictive, and it clouds us and causes high blood pressure and catapults into almost like a snowball of more emotions and just can create chaos. So um, to add to what you talked about and the steps that people can take. So now we've got someone that's become an observer and they're recognizing, okay, I'm being judgmental, or I'm stuck in this past negative thinking, or I'm worried about the future. And then all of that is fear. And life is kind of like stumbling on itself for this person. But once they can understand and they read your book, Pain Without Gain, Gain Without Pain, they can start to recognize for themselves that life is better when you're in that state of gratitude. So, what have you learned about any fears that you've had along the way that is presented in the book or in your own life experience, and how that's helped you with your gain process?
Sure. Well, I have recognized, as I said, I've recognized that we have these two ways of thinking. One of them is to be negative. We have this negativity bias. And the other one is that we have this obsession with the past and the future in ways well beyond what's adaptive and into the maladaptive. And so when I'm afraid of something, I recognize it. So it's like, just as though I might recognize that I've got this tension in my neck and my shoulders, I recognize that I'm being fearful. And I recognize next that this is due to an obsession with the future and my negativity bias. And therefore, the combination of these two tendencies leads to thought processes that are responsible for my fear. And I recognize then that, well, as an observer of my own past, if you will, that my fears have rarely been actualized. Because of this obsession with the future and our negativity bias, we tend to catastrophize. We tend to think of the worst thing that can possibly happen, even though it almost never happens. And I have to say, actually, that in my professional field of pediatric intensive care medicine and pediatric anesthesiology at Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford, it's adaptive to think about the worst thing that could happen. Because I need to do, in my case, the worst thing that could happen is that a patient may die. So it's adaptive for me not to be constantly thinking of that, but at least to bring it into my thought process to the extent that I need to in order to prepare. Excuse me. This may mean that I draw up some drugs that I might not normally have handy for one patient, but for another patient who's got heart failure and all these other complex medical problems, I prepare some drugs, I prepare some syringes for continuous infusion of drugs in case things start to go south. So it's adaptive to think about the worst thing that can happen in that regard. But for most of us, most of the time, it's maladaptive to think of the worst thing that can happen, as this just generates unnecessary fear. We no longer live in an environment where there's a constant threat to our lives. At least most of us don't. And those of us that don't should be grateful that we have a safe and warm environment, and among the other gifts that we have. So when I'm being fearful, I think the key is that I recognize it most of the time. I recognize why I'm having these fearful thoughts because of our negativity bias and this sort of ingrained obsession with the future. And therefore, I can let go of it because I recognize that it's irrational, that the things I'm fearful of are almost certainly not going to happen. And I can rest on what's happened in my life up until now, where the things I'm afraid of, on a moment-to-moment basis, I take care of things so that those feared, circumstances never actually come to pass, or almost never do. So I think, again, it starts with recognition. It starts with understanding what the root cause of this way of thinking is, and then using our purposefulness or intention to sort of attacking it one baby step at a time. And again, after months of reframing the way we think of things, it's remarkable how much progress we can make.
And you've got a good point there that it just takes a small change that creates a great leap. And, we both have experienced things like that in our past. I just want to throw in here real quickly that for people who are listening and watching who may not know, FEAR stands for false evidence appearing real. So if you look at it from that perspective, then you can be as the observer and the acknowledger that, okay, this can be false evidence appearing real. So what is the reality? So then you look at the opposite of, is this really happening now? Do I really need to be fearful? And people can bring themselves back to center in the present and override that fear to settle into what's really happening in the now. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Thank you. So we talked about the brain can reorganize itself by us changing our perspective and our own thinking and trying to, like I said, override the patterns that are like innate in us as humans. You say that gratitude enhances brain power and revives the brain. So the brain is affected by environment, genetics, behavior, thinking, and emotions. So if we're reframing our thoughts with positive thoughts, we're observing when the negative thoughts show up, then basically we're being more mindful. And I know you have a mindfulness practice as part of, I'm thinking, your gratitude and your gain without pain process. So how does someone, in your opinion, look for something good while they still have these negative feelings, emotions, and the environment around them? Because some people, it's difficult for them to be in chaos, to be in a stressful situation. So in your case, as a doctor working with a patient who may be dying, how does a loved one handle being in the present and gratitude uh, in a way that you're doing everything in your best and in your power to make sure that that person stays alive and thrives? And in a personal experience for a person, if they're surrounded by chaos and drama and they want to be positive, but they're so stuck in that repeated experience, what would you suggest to them to be able to still be in that environment? Because some people may not be able to leave it. How can they be adaptive in a positive way to retrain the brain and be able to handle that situation without anxiety, stress, fear, or anger?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is, again, recognition. Why am I having these thoughts kind of going around and becoming self-perpetuating? Um, you know, is it necessary for me to continue to think all the time about the suffering that I'm enduring? And then the recognition is that actually we can change the way we think. And let's take a breath, okay? I think in meditation and in all kinds of self-relaxation techniques, the breath is central. The breath is always there. It's always accessible. So I would say when someone is feeling anxious and fearful and overly focused on their own suffering, they first just kind of take a breath and be intentional about the way we breathe. I think sometimes we get really fearful and we forget to breathe properly. We become really contracted to the point that we're not even taking deep breaths. So slow it down, take a deep breath, maybe inhale very slowly to the count of 4 through your nose and pause to a count of 3 and exhale without effort slowly to a count of 4. Do that a couple of times. And then allow oneself to dwell in the realm of their negative thoughts. And ask oneself, is there not an alternative way to see this?
I like that.
So for example, I lost my son at the age of 29, 4 years ago. And of course, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It's a horrible experience. But at some stage, I paused and took a breath and considered, am I thinking of this correctly? And one thing that I understood as I slowed things down is that I had 29 years with this beautiful kid. And what a gift that was. Do I wish he'd never been born so I wouldn't have to endure the suffering of his death? And the fact is, of course I don't wish that. Now I'm starting to reframe his life in a more positive way. I'm grateful for the 29 years that I had with him. And I start to remember wonderful experiences that we had. We were both making each other laugh uncontrollably and having some deep conversation about, how many universes there are and so on, things he really liked to talk about. And pretty soon I'm smiling and I'm just starting to feel warm. And, maybe I pick up his photograph and I just kind of hold it close to my heart. And so this is just a small example of stopping, connecting to the breath, connecting with our intention. Is it necessary that I think only of my suffering? Am I not capable of thinking of something positive in that experience? I just had shoulder surgery, so I could be thinking, oh, my shoulder hurts all the time. And that's a decision I would make to think about my own suffering all the time, when in fact, my other shoulder is great. I've got, generally a very healthy body and so on. I could easily just reframe the thoughts that I'm having about my body in a positive way. There's always something positive that we can consider to make that decision instead of dwelling only on the negative. So I think, again, the first step is recognition that we're kind of stuck in this cycle of negative thinking, of suffering. Actually, the A in G.A.I.N is acceptance. And the point is that we do need to think about our suffering. We don't need to overthink it, but we don't want to push it away and resist it and try hard not to think about it. Acceptance means that while we get in touch with our breath, we bring ourselves into the present moment, we actually visualize opening our hearts to this suffering and bringing it closer and closer until we merge with it, till there's no separation between the suffering and our heart. And we ask ourselves the question, can I live with this pain for the rest of my life? And when the answer is yes, in fact, we've closed the gap. We've taken on this suffering, which is intrinsically part of life. Life is full of suffering and pain, and it's full of joy as well. And the suffering we have to accept. So, you know, I think that I've rambled a bit as I tend to do, but the point is to recognize this negative way of thinking, to ask oneself, can we in baby steps embrace a different way of thinking, not to resist acceptance of the pain and suffering. On the opposite, on the contrary, rather, accept the pain and suffering. And then at the same time, begin to have thoughts about the positive aspects to whatever it is we're thinking about. Because there always are positive aspects as long as we're here and breathing.
So the key, yeah, well, the key that it sounds like you're stressing is to accept whatever the emotion is and the feeling, and then uh, ask yourself, is there another way I can think about it? Or what is another way? Because if you ask yourself, is there, then a part of you is going to say, no, there's not. It's going to keep you stuck.
Is there the opportunity to be grateful here? We're
right.
talking about gratitude. I'm suffering because I'm thinking of having lost my son. Is there an opportunity to be grateful about my son? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, there is. There's always choice. So I liken it to a coin. There's two sides to a coin. And, there's the positive side and there's the negative thinking side. So it's our choice. It's our choice as an individual. Which side do we want to focus on? And what you focus on, you get more of. So I think, if there's any message in this conversation today, it's you can change your thinking. You can make the choice to get unstuck from those habitual patterns. And you shared a lot of insight into why we have, from a medical perspective, from a neurological perspective, why people have a challenge to be in that present moment in gratitude. And I think you're a perfect example of having had some hard life experiences, more than one, that you shared with us today. So thank you for that. And you've come out the other side. And I believe the book as a whole, and especially this chapter on gratitude, is a pivotal point that can be for people to go from the judgmental and ungrateful space into the space of gratitude, being an observer, recognizing, I do have that option, I do have that choice, but I have to be the one to make it. I can't make anybody else do it for me. So I want to talk about one more thing, and then I got a couple questions for you. So a lot of people suffer from that negative thinking and the scarcity mindset. So they're comparing themselves to others, even their own experiences. And it brings about the thoughts of, well, someone's better, smarter, wiser, more, further along in life, and then I'm here. And that brings them back to the thinking of the past, woulda, coulda, shoulda, and the future of what can I do? I'm going to be a nobody, or whatever their thoughts are. When someone can motivate themselves and be able to take the information you shared today and we've talked about, to me, it brings about hope for them, right? It brings in a element of inspiration that comes from within. So is there anything that you want to impart to people as we close out this interview before I ask you your two questions? Um, what would be the most important aspect of gratitude that someone can be inspired to take that first step, to become the observer and to recognize that their negative thinking is not healthy for them, and that it's tied to their mood and their thinking and their interaction with others and their job and their relationships? So, what is something you can impart and share that someone listening and watching can say, yeah, it's easier said than done? How can you inspire someone to realize it's simple? It's really simple.
Sure. I think it's a personal thing. I think that the answer to that question may be different for each individual person. So for somebody who, let's say, go to something that you really enjoy, that you truly appreciate, that can be gazing at the stars, it can be horticulture, it could be walking in the forest, and contemplate that notion, the flower, the stamens, the petals, the aroma of that flower, if that's your thing. And imagine what a miracle it is that life evolved in a way that this flower even exists. And for me, I just, Einstein said that, and I'm probably paraphrasing, there's two ways of looking at the world. One is though everything is a miracle, and the other is that nothing is a miracle. I think it's more powerful if you say it the other way around.
Yeah.
So one way of looking at the world is that nothing is a miracle, and the other way of looking at the world is that everything is a miracle. And for me, everything is a miracle. So if you want to have immediate access to your gratitude, think about something that really you find most beautiful and be grateful for the miracle of that thing. And I think of, I'm a scientist, but I'm also a student of Advaita or non-duality. I think of the miracle of everything. I mean, as we're talking right now, Eileen, I think it's just such a miracle that there you are in Florida and here I am in California, and we're talking to each other live with images. And, when I drill down and think about that, how is that even possible? And it's just a miracle.
Miraculous, yes.
It is.
I agree.
And so again, I'm going to go with one of my heroes, Albert Einstein, and just focus on the fact that everything is a miracle. And I think the answer to your question may be different for everybody. I would just say for each individual, take something that you think is so powerfully beautiful, and imagine what a miracle it is that exists at all. How did we go from a bunch of protein molecules floating around in the primordial ocean to this beautiful yellow rose? How did that happen? And I'm so grateful that it did. And I think this kind of way of thinking reminds us that there is so much for which to be grateful.
I agree with you 100%. So if you have anything to add, one of my questions is, what are you grateful for today? If there's anything additional to what you just shared.
Well, in the chapter on intention in my book, I talk about, as you and I have discussed, the way that we can influence the workings of our minds, that our minds are malleable, or we have this neuroplasticity. And one great example of that is this program at Duke called 3 Good Things. So they have studied tens of thousands of people, and what they've discovered is that simply by thinking of 3 good things before you go to bed, 3 positive things that happen to you during the day, ultimately you'll sleep better and you'll be a happier person. And that's something that takes almost no time. You do it while you're turning the bed down or what have you. So 3 good things for me today will include this conversation, Eileen. And so I'm grateful for the technology, for the human heart, for your particular human heart, which I think is a beautiful heart. And so this conversation that we're having, Eileen, will be among my 3 good things tonight. And so I would just, remind everyone to remember we have a negativity bias. We can overcome that in baby steps. Start with a 3 good things practice. Establish a habit of thinking about 3 positive, wonderful things for which you're grateful that happen each day before you go to sleep at night. And that's what I do.
I love that, because that can also create that new neural pathway and override the negative thinking.
And all you have to do is be intentional and purposeful about it. It's, you know, this stuff is not rocket science. It's all very fundamental and basic. And, you know, thinking of 3 good things before you go to sleep is something that everyone can do. And it's remarkable what a positive effect such small things can have in the aggregate.
And it happens on its own. You know, all you do is put in that positive intention, and then the rest takes care of itself. And thank you for your kind words. I greatly appreciate that.
I like the idea of focusing on one thing that we each think is particularly simple and miraculous, and focus our gratitude on that for a few minutes. And if we do that, we get a little dopamine hit. It makes us feel better, and it should. We're not kidding ourselves. These things for which to be grateful are ever present. The fact that we exist is among them. So I think my only words of wisdom are to remember that we do have a negativity bias, but if we start to focus on positive things, and that certainly includes our gratitude, we can rewire our brains. And I think gratitude is a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate you interviewing and having the conversation with me again. And we do have a few more chapters to tap into in the future. So we will be reconnecting. And I wish you all the best. And we will be back in touch.
Absolutely, Eileen. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.
You're welcome. Bye.